Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into a big barrel-aged Imperial Stout from Braxton Brewing Company. They're based in Covington, Kentucky. This specific beer is called Dark Charge Mole. I am pretty sure that they have different versions of this same beer. This is Mole kind of inspired. Imperial Stout clocking in at 12% ABV on this one. It has been bourbon barrel aged and it's also been brewed with ancho chilies, vanilla, cinnamon, and cocoa. So this is what I expect is going to be another one of these kind of sort of similar themed flavor profile big Imperial Stouts. We've had quite a few over the years, and there's a reason that brewers are using these ingredients in this beer style. It's because it works exceptionally well. So this obviously kind of a beer take on typical Mexican mole sauce. And with this ingredient list and that bourbon barrel aging, I expect it's going to be quite nice. They did give some specifics. It is a 2021 release. This is part of what they call their Heritage Series. And let's see, going down. Yeah, they don't give the specific bourbon barrels that they used, but they do quite clearly say that it has been bourbon barrel aged. So coming from Kentucky, no shortage of those. I'm expecting that this is going to be quite nice. Label art on it, it's just a nice clean design. Nothing too fancy or too much to talk about there. So we've got our nice trusty stout glass. We'll get this cracked. This is a very large bottle. We will not get the whole thing in this glass, but let's go ahead and get it poured. Very dark, very thick. I'm going to be pretty aggressive down the middle, give it a chance to form a head here properly. Yeah, it seems to be doing a good job. It is pretty active in terms of carbonation. I can already see that on the sides of the glass. But it looks like mostly tighter, finer kind of effervescence coming up. So we'll see if we get lucky and that head sticks around pretty well. Yeah, visually as expected, it is pitch black. The cling on the sides, the effervescence, it is very tight. Tiny effervescence coming up out of this beer. And it did form quite a nice, thick, rich, creamy head. Let's get right up over this for a sniff. Oh man, wow. Well, that smells phenomenal. Wow, so what really jumps out at me on this one is a combination of a few things. And it's not kind of the norm that you get on this kind of similar type themed beer flavor profile on an Imperial Stout. When I'm getting strongly on the nose, the bourbon, that's a given. It's bourbon barrel aged. You're always going to get that. But the cinnamon and the vanilla on this in particular are really jumping out of the glass. But it definitely is leading, aside from the bourbon, with the cinnamon and the vanilla. I didn't expect that, but it smells absolutely phenomenal. And yes, ancho chili's in here. I'm not really picking up anything that smells like an ancho chili on the nose, but I do expect it will be present in the flavor profile. Head has settled down, but it's still holding true. Nice, thick, creamy pad floating on top. Let's just jump right in, see what this one's about. Oh, man. Oh, boy. That is delicious. That is delicious. This is a big, bold, flavorful beer. I expected it to be, and it delivered. It delivered. So the first thing I want to talk about while my brain is processing all of these flavors and how they're kind of interweaving through one another is the body and the mouthfeel. It's a 12% Imperial Stout. It feels like it has a nice, solid, medium, heavy body. I would say it feels pretty much exactly where I would expect for this beer style in this ABV range. Feels right. The mouthfeel, same thing too. It's got a lot of resistance to it. You can really feel the viscosity when you're moving it around the palate. This one does get nice and creamy with heavy agitation. So as you're kind of aerating and letting everything coat the palate, it really does feel quite creamy, quite silky. It's a very nice, thick, resistant, and silky mouthfeel that goes with this nice medium heavy body. It feels exactly right for the style in the ABV range. So texture-wise, weight-wise, it's exactly on the money where I thought it would be. In terms of this flavor profile, so I mentioned On the nose, big notes of cinnamon and vanilla, aside from the bourbon itself being the dominant aromas. I could tell you in this flavor profile, the cinnamon in tandem with the bourbon and the underlying roasty malt bill is what hit me first. They were not shy at all with their use of cinnamon in this beer, and I love it. And because this is not a milk stout, it's not sweet at all. It really does put me in mind of how I personally take my coffee. So very dark, black, bitter, roasty, intense with cinnamon. And it tastes absolutely fantastic. So there's a lot happening in this flavor profile and the way that it interweaves. But I can tell you on the front side, the first things you get in tandem, the bourbon barrel and the cinnamon. That comes out right out at you. And if anything, I would say the cinnamon maybe is even a bit more prevalent than the bourbon. So the bourbon is playing maybe a little back. It's kind of where I think this ancho chili is binding in this flavor profile the most. But that in tandem with this big burst of big, earthy, roasty, bordering on char of this deeply roasted malt bill. And there's really actually a nice kick of bitters. It's not a sweet beer. And even though it's barrel aged, it's higher ABV, it's not one of those that taste sweet, even at all, even on the front side and certainly not on the back end. It's got a nice, rich, roasty backbone to it, and it's really big and bold. So a lot to process here. I'm going to jump back in for a second sip. We're going to let everything re-intensify. I'm going to really pay acute attention to whether or not I can pick out the vanilla on second sip and precisely where I think the ancho chilies are. I have a pretty good idea from my first sip, but there's a lot happening here, and there's a lot of interweaving and ebbing and flowing of the intensities of these flavor profiles. So I'm going to jump back in, we're going to take two, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the finish. But on first sip, I absolutely love it. All of these big Imperial Stouts with these relatively similar kind of added ingredients list, there's a reason brewers are doing them. It's because it absolutely works. And this is another example of exactly that. So take two. Delicious. It's immediate. Cinnamon and bourbon right up front. It's huge. Within about the first second and a half, 2 seconds, after this just whoosh, bourbon and cinnamon, that's when you get hit with the first sense of just how deeply roasted and bitter forward this malt bill is. And I love it for that. I love it for that. I think this beer is all the better for it. It's in that time that you just get hit with roast and a big kick of bitters. And it's kind of at that point where I first am starting to get the vanilla notes as well. And it first is binding very well with that cinnamon and that bourbon barrel. And then it kind of settles back as the underpinning of the roastiness, the earthiness, the char, and the bitter side of the malt bill opens up further and further. That's when kind of the vanilla starts to dial back down. But you've always got this ever-present cinnamon and bourbon still riding right there in this flavor profile as they start to ebb and flow and move in and out of one another. The ancho chili, to me, is really kind of binding on the finish side of the equation. And ancho chili is not a super spicy chili, but it's got a ton of aroma and flavor. While I couldn't pick out the aroma, it's definitely coming out in the flavor profile. And actually, it seems to be binding not only with that bourbon, but it's also binding quite well with that cinnamon. And that combination of flavors, absolutely beautiful together. Now, the cocoa that they put in this, that to me is really coming through very dominant when you get to the end of the finish side. So from about the 20 to 30 second mark, as it's making its slow, steady descent in intensity, that's when the cocoa actually really starts to come up and you're starting to get these chocolatey notes that are really coming out of this malt bill. And it's making that cocoa that they put in here pop. And that too is still binding with the cinnamon, and the ancho chili is still hanging on there. And that's when it really starts to take on, instead of all these big layers of flavor and intensity with bourbon and all these other underpinnings coming out of the roast of the malt bill, That's really on the back end when it truly starts to settle and taste like actual mole sauce, like you would get in a restaurant or make it home. But it's really, really well crafted. This is a big, bold beer. It's got a big body. It's got a big mouthfeel. It is just absolutely packed with flavor. But there's a ton of nuance and layering that's happening with this. And I gotta say, I love the balance of ingredients. They were not shy. They used pretty heavy hands with the additives, but the way that they work together in this beer is absolutely top notch. This is an extremely, extremely well-crafted beer. I've had many, many stouts with kind of similar derivatives of this similar added ingredient list, but this is one of the better ones that I've had to date, to be certain. I absolutely love it. What a tremendous beer. I'm going to take my time, sip on this one, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get this beer ranked from top to bottom. All right, now we're going to get this beer ranked. This was Braxton Brewing Company's Dark Charge Mole 2021 release, an Imperial Stout clocking in at 12% ABV, brewed with ancho chilies, vanilla, cinnamon, and cocoa. This was bourbon barrel aged. Braxton Brewing Company is based in Covington, Kentucky. So this was one of those beers that just missed. I mean, it just did miss perfection across the board. There was one category where it did not get a perfect score, and that was in the finish. And it really just missed it by a hair. The finish on this one was well above average. Just didn't have quite the impetus from the bourbon barrel that you would normally find on a bourbon barrel aged big high ABV stout like this. But the finish still got a 9 out of 10, which does give a perfect 10 out of 10 in all other 9 remaining categories. That's aroma, taste, body, mouthfeel, head and retention, appearance, balance, feeling in the intangible, my subjective thoughts category, and example of the style. So Braxton Brewing Company's Dark Charge Mole 2021 release does get a 99 out of 100. Guys, this was about as close to perfection as it gets. There's a lot of similar type kind of additive ingredients, big imperial stouts, some barrel aged, some not. This was one of the better ones. I've had probably 10 to 15 different stouts with relatively similar additive ingredient bills, and they're all kind of going for that same vibe. And this one was absolutely spectacular. The underlying malt bill was tremendous. And for me, what really set this one apart was the intensity of the cinnamon. And cinnamon is one of those ingredients it tends to stand out, but they really were not shy with the volume in this. And sure, plenty of cinnamon. The ancho really binded well with both the cinnamon, also elements of the vanilla and the bourbon barrel. And the cocoa really binded well with that underlying malt bill. So the way that they built this beer, they were really clever with their volume of ingredients that they added and how it interplayed with the base beer itself and the bourbon barrel aging. And it was just an absolute treat. If you're a fan of these beers like this, these big imperial stouts that are kind of going for mole, some chilies, vanilla, cocoa, cinnamon, things of that nature, this is definitely one to keep on your radar. I do highly recommend it. I got mine from Tavour, but I'm guessing you can find this in a well-stocked bottle shop or if you live anywhere in the general immediate Kentucky area, but absolutely worth your time. Fabulous beer. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live, just turn on your notifications, hit that bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.